Aiko never believed in superstitions. She grew up in Japan, where everyone seemed to whisper warnings about the number 4. It's the number of death, they'd say, as if the mere mention of it could bring bad luck. But Aiko was different. She didn't let ancient fears rule her life. When she moved to the United States to study at a prestigious university, she thought of it as a fresh start, far away from the old superstitions that she found silly. The apartment she rented was small but cozy, just a short walk from campus. The landlord hesitated when offering her the place, mentioning something about the room number, but Aiko didn't care. It was room 4, and to her, it was just a number. Nothing more. Life in the US was exciting and new. She quickly fell in love with an American student named Mark. He was charming, with a smile that could light up the darkest room, and he made her feel like the luckiest girl in the world. They were inseparable, their love a beautiful, whirlwind romance that made everything seem perfect. But perfection is often an illusion. Aiko's happiness began to crumble when she found out she was pregnant. It wasn't part of the plan, but she believed Mark would stand by her. After all, their love was strong, wasn't it? When she told him the news, he smiled, but something in his eyes had changed. Aiko could feel the distance growing between them, though she tried to ignore it. Then, one evening, as she walked back to her apartment, she saw them. Mark, with another girl. They were laughing, holding hands, oblivious to the world around them. Aiko's heart shattered into a million pieces. She confronted him that night, but he didn't even try to lie. "I'm sorry, Aiko," he said, his voice cold and unfamiliar. It's over." Aiko was devastated. The pain was too much to bear. She felt alone in a foreign country, with no one to turn to. The life growing inside her, once a symbol of love, now felt like a cruel reminder of her betrayal. The walls of her apartment seemed to close in on her, the silence heavy and suffocating. That night, Aiko made a decision. She couldn't go on like this, couldn't live with the heartbreak, the betrayal. In the quiet of her apartment, she found a rope, tied it to the ceiling fan, and without a second thought, she ended it. Her last breath was taken in that cursed room, room 4. Weeks passed, and the apartment remained empty, its eerie silence unbroken. The landlord, unaware of the tragedy, eventually rented it out again. But the new tenants didn't stay long. They spoke of strange occurrences, whispers in the night, cold spots that chilled them to the bone, and the feeling of being watched. Mark, racked with guilt, tried to move on, but he was haunted by nightmares. He dreamed of Aiko, her face pale, her eyes filled with sorrow. In the dreams, she would reach out to him, her voice a soft, mournful whisper. "Why did you betray me?" she would ask, over and over, until he woke up in a cold sweat. One night, driven by guilt and desperation, Mark returned to the apartment. He had to see it for himself, had to confront the ghost that haunted his dreams. He stood outside the door of room 4, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. The air around him grew colder, and he could swear he heard a soft, distant cry. When he finally stepped inside, the room was dark and cold. The smell of decay lingered in the air, and the faint outline of the rope could still be seen hanging from the ceiling fan. He called out her name, but the only response was a chilling silence. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. In the darkness, he saw her, Aiko, her face twisted in anguish, her eyes hollow and lifeless. She moved toward him, her feet barely touching the ground. "Why, Mark?" she whispered, her voice echoing in the empty room. "Why did you betray me?" Mark tried to speak, to apologize, but his voice caught in his throat. The room grew colder, the air thick with a sense of dread. Aiko's ghostly figure moved closer, her presence overwhelming, suffocating. "You made me do this," she whispered, her voice filled with a sadness that cut through him like a knife. "You made me choose death." Mark collapsed to the floor, his body trembling with fear. He could feel her icy breath on his skin, her cold fingers brushing against his cheek. The last thing he saw before everything went black was her face, twisted in a grotesque smile, as she whispered, "Now, you'll never leave." The next day, Mark was found dead in the apartment, his face frozen in terror, his eyes wide open in a final, silent scream. The cause of death was never determined, but those who knew the story whispered about the curse of Room 4, the room where Aiko had died, and where her spirit now lingered, forever seeking the love and peace that had been stolen from her. From that day on, the apartment remained vacant, the number 4 forever associated with the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Those who passed by would feel a chill in the air, a sense of unease, as if Aiko's sorrowful spirit was still searching for the love that had betrayed her, haunting the place where her life, and her love, had come to an end. Years passed, and the story of Aiko and Room 4 faded into a distant memory, a tale whispered only in hushed tones among the locals. The apartment building, now old and run down, was eventually sold to a wealthy businessman looking to capitalize on the prime location near the university. He saw potential where others saw only decay. He bought the building, tore down the old walls, and transformed it into a luxurious apartment complex, complete with modern amenities and sleek, stylish interiors. Despite its dark past, the businessman saw Room 4 as just another part of the renovation project. He erased its history with fresh paint and new furnishings, turning it into a beautiful, cozy space that any student would be thrilled to rent. The old Room 4, with its grim memories, was now a thing of the past, at least, that's what everyone believed. The room was quickly rented by a young man named Daniel, a student at the same university where Aiko had once studied. Daniel was charming, ambitious, and popular on campus. He had a bright future ahead of him, and the newly renovated Room 4 seemed like the perfect place to begin this chapter of his life. At first, everything was perfect. The apartment was peaceful, the air fresh and clean, and Daniel felt lucky to have found such a great place so close to school. But peace is often deceptive. One evening, Daniel invited his girlfriend, Emily, over to the apartment. They worked on their school projects, laughed, and talked about their future together. The apartment was warm, filled with the glow of young love, and Daniel felt at ease, as if the room itself welcomed them. But things began to change when Daniel brought another girl, Megan, to the apartment a few days later. He charmed her the same way he had charmed Emily, oblivious to the history of the room he was in. As they talked and laughed, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, and a subtle tension filled the air, though Daniel didn't notice. That night, after Megan left, Daniel started to notice strange things. It began with a faint, metallic smell, something he couldn't quite place. He dismissed it, thinking it was just the old pipes in the building. But the next morning, he found streaks of what looked like dried blood smeared across one of the walls. He tried to scrub it off, but the stain seemed to seep deeper into the paint, almost as if the wall was bleeding. Later, as he washed his face in the bathroom, the faucet suddenly turned on by itself, the water rushing out in a torrent. He jumped back, startled, but when he reached to turn it off, the water stopped on its own. His reflection in the mirror flickered for just a moment, a shadow passing behind him, but when he turned, no one was there. The next night, Daniel awoke to find his room freezing cold. Shivering, he reached for the light switch, but the room remained dark. His breath came out in misty clouds, and he saw it, words scrawled on the wall in a dark, dripping substance, "You are just like him." Panic gripped him as he scrambled to turn on every light, but the darkness seemed to cling to him. He looked around, his eyes wide with fear, and that's when he saw her. Aiko's ghost stood at the foot of his bed, her once beautiful face twisted with sorrow and anger. Her eyes, dark and hollow, bore into him, and she slowly raised her hand, pointing directly at him. "You betrayed her," she whispered, her voice cold and accusing. "Just like he did." Daniel's heart raced as he tried to rationalize what he was seeing, but there was no escape from the terror that filled the room. The next day, he tried to go about his life as usual, but Aiko's presence haunted him. The words on the wall reappeared no matter how many times he painted over them. The water in the bathroom turned on and off by itself. Every night, she stood at the foot of his bed, pointing at him, her eyes filled with hatred. Despite the warnings, Daniel continued to date both Emily and Megan, believing that he could somehow escape the curse that now plagued him. But Aiko's spirit grew more restless, more vengeful with each passing day. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker, until one night, the terror reached its peak. That night, Daniel awoke to find the room colder than ever. He tried to move, but his body was paralyzed with fear. Aiko's ghost loomed over him, her face twisted in a grotesque smile. The rope that had once ended her life dangled from the ceiling, and before Daniel could scream, it wrapped itself around his neck, tightening with an invisible force. As the life drained from his body, the last thing Daniel saw was Aiko's face, her eyes filled with sorrow and satisfaction. She had found her justice. The next morning, Daniel's lifeless body was discovered by the landlord, hanging from the ceiling fan, his face frozen in the same terror that had claimed Aiko. The whispers of the old curse spread quickly, and the once beautiful, luxurious apartment complex was soon abandoned, left to decay like the memories of those who had died within its walls. Eventually, the building was condemned, its history too dark and terrifying to be ignored. It was torn down, piece by piece, until nothing remained but an empty lot. But even now, those who pass by at night claim to hear a soft, mournful whisper in the wind, and see the faint outline of a young woman standing where room 4 once was, forever mourning the love that was taken from her.